My name is Josef Powdrell. I am in a position to be able to speak to you this afternoon, or at this moment, about Juneteenth. I appreciate the APAC giving me the opportunity to speak. Annette, thank you so very much. It's really important that at this time in particular that we talk about the significance of Juneteenth, its importance to us, why we should keep it, what do we benefit from observing it, and what's going to perpetuate it. So thanks for the opportunity. First of all, I'd like to say that Juneteenth is our sovereign piece of history. It's our piece of history, O-U-R. It is our piece of American history that we really have laid claim to. And we've laid claim to it in such a way it has become a celebration. Juneteenth originated in 1865, Galveston, Texas, for the purpose of making Texas, which was the last slave state, aware of the fact that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed and that it was specifically implicating freedom for the enslaved population. 4 million people at that time. I always think that this is the beginning of the black nation of America. The American African nation. I feel like it started at that time. We became a nation of people all under the same kind of stimulus, same kind of situation that you have to deal with. But it later on went on, and the name Juneteenth has been attached to it, and it has grown over a period of 155 years now. We're talking, this celebration is 155 years. It is a ritual that we need to sustain and claim. My involvement with it has convinced me that this is vital, this is imperative for us to keep. And I've had the luxury of being a promoter, a conductor of Juneteenth. 1976 here in Albuquerque. We started off with a crowd of about 800 people. And over those 13 years, we had some of the most precious times possible in Albuquerque. And we had a population attendance up to the level of probably 8,000 people at one point in time. We televised, or we broadcasted into the prison, the correctional institutions of Albuquerque in New Mexico, throughout the state. We had a simulcast where they were able to listen. The inmates were able to be at Juneteenth. It was huge. And more importantly, it was ours. And that's really the emphasis behind this particular conversation here. Just to urge us to own it, to benefit from it, to leverage it, to teach it, to perpetuate it. I think that's so important. If I say nothing, let me say that. It's ours. And all the benefits that come from it initially should be ours. And yes, we have to share it with the rest of this country. But we'll share it as ours. We'll share it as a unique piece of American history that speaks to us directly. It speaks to us directly in our relationship with this country. In the mid-70s, and we started the celebration. I was working for the city at the time, had access to a lot of public facilities, so we started Dennis Chavis Center. There are a couple of people, Ed Johnson's one of them, Clarence Smith, Nazim Pasha, and a number of people. There's too many to mention, but these were people in the very, very, very beginning. And it grew. We had 800 people, over 800 people at the first one, the very first one. The next year we were at 2,000. By the time we got to 1982, we had 2 stages operating at the same time. And what's important about that is not what we were doing. Juneteenth was growing in the minds and the souls of people. And that kind of snuck up on me. I had the luxury of meeting a UNM professor by the name of Dr. Baisha Batan, who hit me one day with, you need to get a grip on this thing because it's huge. And your role in it is very significant, particularly in New Mexico. Start thinking about the history, the historical importance of this event. And it kind of shocked me because I hadn't thought about any of that. All I thought about was just trying to make it happen every year. So it dawned on me that this thing was growing, and it was going to continue to grow. And what Dr. Patan said to me, we need to make plans to preserve it, to claim it, to teach it, to preach it. It has an atoning effect on us.
Hi, my name is Rita. I am the Executive Director of the African American Museum and Cultural Center of New Mexico, which has been in existence since 2002. So I am happy to be here today. I was invited by Josef to speak on Juneteenth and the historical significance of the celebration of Juneteenth. So the historical significance to a museum is that as African Americans, we have to own our history. We have to be responsible for our history and its interpretation. And Juneteenth is an important part of the legacy of African American history. And it's based on the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Abraham Lincoln, giving freedom to enslaved people in the rebelling southern states. And about 70,000 enslaved people were taken into Texas by the plantation owners after the start of the Civil War, hoping that in Texas they would still be able to own slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation is when we as African Americans embraced the thought of our freedom.
Independently, there were a lot of courageous African Americans who emancipated themselves prior to. And I think what happened in Texas, you had a number of people who just decided to perpetuate the emancipation process on their own. And that's historical. That's history that I didn't realize, in the process of discussion with Rita about the history of it. Those kind of things come out. We'd be surprised how courageous African American people have been, behaving around this particular document. It gives rise to the Amendment 13, 14, and 15. It's a powerful piece, historical piece.
Well, and I think historically African Americans, with the Emancipation Proclamation, we embraced our freedom and the responsibility of freedom. So one of the first things that happened in Texas was we were looking for places of sanctuary where we could define who we were and give ourselves self-determination. And the African American churches were the places of sanctuary. So about 150 churches sprung up in Texas immediately. And they were places where we could congregate and we could define who we were and we could embrace our freedoms. And we also started African American towns. So there were many African American towns in Texas and throughout the West, which gave us sovereignty, sanctuary, and the ability to define who we were in spite of the oppressiveness around us, and the courage to embrace and be responsible for our freedom. Because after the Civil War, there was violence, terror perpetrated on African Americans. We were killed at will, and no one was held accountable for our deaths. So very little had changed since enslavement, where African Americans could be killed and nobody would be responsible, and what we're seeing today, where African Americans are being killed and nobody is held responsible and nobody goes to jail. So being responsible for our freedom and not allowing ourselves to be put back in a place where we think we are less than someone else, where we abdicate our freedom, took courage. And that courage exists up until this day and the demonstrations we're seeing right now.
You know, the historical baton to be passed, you know, it's important for the contemporary generations to understand that what is happening on the stage of America has always been happening. And to understand it, how it happens today, and to connect it with how it's happened in the past. That's really crucial. Juneteenth plays a significant role. It's interesting that it would happen at a time where all of this is happening. Right now, I think the African American community, the North American African American community, has a lot of power behind what is happening. The whole world is watching right now. And we get a chance to say, this has been our history in this country. It continues. Why is it continuing in this fashion? And celebrating Juneteenth is celebrating, maintaining the thought of sovereignty and maintaining a relationship with this country that is still subject to being reparated and repaired. So it all ties in rather beautifully as far as I'm concerned. Juneteenth is really important. I hope we never abandon the importance of it. I hope we never do that. I think it would be deadly for us to do that. You know, Dr. King talked about the sovereign responsibility of emancipation. You know, I just to paraphrase, you know, he said, if the Negro is to truly be free, I'm paraphrasing him a bit, he'll have to reach into his own soul and pick up the pen of self-assertion and write his own proclamation of emancipation. He said slavery can be banished, but racism won't be. So it's important that we sovereignly own the responsibility of our presence on this face of this part of the earth, this place in the universe. Sovereignty means us owning the responsibility of ourselves, our history, our posterity, and you know, sovereignty gives you your own reward. You get that in return. Nobody can give you sovereignty. We can keep petitioning these people all we want. They can't give you. Sovereignty is something, as Dr. King says, you have to accept it. You have to reach into yourself and own that for yourself.
Yeah, I would like to take a quote from one of our writers and philosophers, James Baldwin. And he had a quote when things were really getting dismal. And Martin Luther King had been assassinated, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Reagan had been elected president. And in the midst of that despair, he said, "Not everything is lost. Responsibility is never lost. It can only be abdicated. And if you don't abdicate it, then you get up and you begin again." And beginning again means we begin again with our legacy and our history and the power of that history and the courage of that history. And when I see these demonstrations going on today,
beautiful.
That's what I see. I see young people who are taking responsibility and beginning again and assuming the mantle of being responsible for freedom.
This is the next generation that has a perspective that will be incorporated. We're fortunate, Rita and I both are fortunate to have a portion of the next generation. And we are endowed with their perspective. I think everybody who has children, grandchildren, listen, make them discuss it. Because how can they take the baton if it's not discussed and understood? And so we're fortunate to have that.
I think that's the topic at hand, though, is the baton that is Juneteenth.
Yes,
how does that get passed on? What do you guys feel like the future of Juneteenth is? I mean, we've had certain experiences of it, but you guys are, I don't know, been a little bit more hands-on.
Well, I guess working with the museum, what I see is Juneteenth is a part of a total picture of African American history that we're responsible for. And so what the museum is moving forward with is making visible the total picture of our history, which includes Juneteenth. We have the responsibility of our own history. We've got the responsibility of making it visible and believing that our history is vital and valuable to the whole of American history. So to me, being with the museum, that's where I see Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a vital part of our continuing history in the United States of America.
I think the future of Juneteenth is pretty much like the future of African American people, this African American sovereign nation. I think what happens to Juneteenth, there's a correlation by what happens to Juneteenth as to what happens to us. And it's all a matter of how well you can transfer the obligation of history. Juneteenth is a tool for us to use to transport to the coming times to come. It's a tool, an instrument that we should use to transfer the importance of history, the obligation of history, the beauty of history, the love of history, the art of it all. You know, that's the future. I think it'll come from how well we manage our own consciousness in this country.
What they said.
Go ahead.
For me, I'd say the future of Juneteenth, I think, doesn't end at this day. And I think that it's something that needs to be continually practiced and leveraged, as they said several times. Juneteenth is ours. And so I think especially now in these times of social unrest, it is imperative for us to utilize the energy and the voices of everyone expressing their discontent with the treatment of Black people here in America. I think it's a very important time for us to really unite here in the state of New Mexico. There are so few of us, and I think now is the time to leverage and to continue this Juneteenth sovereignty and to have discussions within our community to make changes and to make sure that we are speaking to one another and that we are making changes for our people here in New Mexico, and to take that up to, you know, the rest of the world here in the United States. Something like that.
Yeah. Starts within. I think you guys both spoke to that. You know what I mean? You can't make any change outside of yourself if the change hasn't come from within. And like you said, our community is so small here. I think the majority of you watching this video, we didn't even need to do introductions. You know us, we know you. You know what I'm saying? We've grown up in the same neighborhoods. We all went to the same schools. It's ours. And so really becoming a collective, becoming a unit, coming together and changing within, so that we can go and change everything outside of ourselves, you know what I mean? And having those conversations, pushing the envelope, encouraging each other, just becoming that community, a strong, really strong fist, you know what I mean? Not separate fingers. We all need to come together to kind of pack a punch, point blank.
You know, Richard, you bring up a point that I think is important. I don't think the cultures in the state of New Mexico really understand who we sovereignly are. I think we have not done as good a job about it, making it clear who Americans of African descent are in New Mexico and what responsibility that is to us. And it's important to this state's stability that we stand up and accept the responsibility of our own sovereignty. You got sovereign nations. You got sovereign nations in New Mexico. We are one of them. But we have to assume responsibility for it. The future of Juneteenth hinges on our ability to assume the sovereign responsibility for our story and how it's told and who tells it. I'm telling you.
What they said.
You know, the last thing I really want to say is enjoy Juneteenth. Enjoy Juneteenth. It is yours. It is like medicine to your soul. Let's don't cheat ourselves being in this part of the country. The small number of us, there's an advantage to being small. It means we can actually take the time to talk to each other, take the time to encourage, take the time to teach, take the time to remind. There are advantages in New Mexico. Let's make it clear who we are to ourselves first and foremost, and the state will be the beneficiary of that. Thank you.